The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a message tonight for all my colleagues here in the House of Commons, and especially for everyone here at home in Fleetwood Port Kells who are having a rightfully good debate right now about the justifications for using the Emergency Measures Act. And I wanted to provide my own thoughts and the rationale behind my support for the government's actions. To do that, let's focus specifically on the questions in this debate. Is the government's use of the Emergency Measures Act justified? And are the measures being invoked legally? Well, the second answer is the easiest or the second question is easiest to answer, because that answer is yes, if the measures being used to deal with the situation conform with the legislation that's been on the books since the 1980s. But given that this is the first time that this legislation has been used, there should be scrutiny of the measures to make sure that they do conform with the law. But that is the easy part. But we have to talk about the justification. The Act is right to the point. It says a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that A, seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians, and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. Or B, seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and the territorial integrity of Canada. So let's take that apart and look at the evidence. Does the current situation endanger the lives of Canadians? Well, the border disruption certainly endangered the economic quality of life for Canadians and therefore their well-being. And there is ample evidence of that in Windsor, especially in the auto sector, or for so many businesses and their employees in Ottawa. The threats of physical violence to people in Ottawa's downtown neighborhood have been real. And charges have been laid against the 13 in Coutts, Alberta, apparently because they appeared ready to murder RCMP officers. Does the activity endanger our health? Well, there's no doubt that the premature lifting of public health measures, as demanded by these protesters, would do this. We saw this very clearly in Alberta last year when they lifted the mandates for the best summer ever, and it wasn't. So we don't want a repeat of that. But the stated aim of the protest is to force the government to abandon public health measures regardless of the advice from the Public Health Agency of Canada and provincial authorities. Do the blockades endanger safety? Well, when protesters harass and bully people and threaten assault, yes. When protesters allegedly tried to set fire to a residential building in Ottawa, gluing the door shut in the process, yes, indeed. When police find that cache of weapons, such as was seized in Coutts, Alberta, how could there not be a perception that public safety was endangered? Does the situation exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it? Well, not in every case, but certainly in some, notably in Ontario, which is why the use of the Emergency Measures Act clearly sets out that it can be specifically targeted to locations where provincial authorities need additional help to restore order. And to the point that's been raised a few times, well, all these things were cleared up just as the Emergency Measures Act was being announced. Let's face it. We want to prevent them from bringing disorder back to those locations, which is a real and current threat. Do the current actions threaten Canada's sovereignty and security? Well, the manifesto of this group calls for Canada's democratically elected government to be deposed and the government turned over to a committee made up of, in part, by them. So we put a check mark next to that one. But there'll be some who say, well, the answer is no. If you consider the protesters at face value, it's just some good old boys and girls and kids in big trucks challenging the government to preserve God-given and charter-enshrined rights and freedoms. But the people who believe that, like some of our conservative colleagues, have been deceived. They've been gamed by crafty, intense, gray-faced agents of passive-aggressive manipulation and sedition. One can only imagine the information our security services have on them. And the gaming that they performed has been intense indeed. Canada has had a long and sometimes very colorful history of civil disobedience, where people break the law and the police show patience and restraint while the protesters make their point. Then, having made their point on a reasonably transparent agenda, they and the government trade ideas, the deal is done, and the protesters go home. Well, those behind the blockade and occupations know this, and they have gamed us to a fare thee well. They allegedly gamed the Ottawa Police Service. Oh, we'll do our thing for a few days and then leave, while planning to use this grace period to dig in. They may have also gamed Ottawa's mayor, who thought there was a deal to get some of the trucks out of the residential areas until one of the leaders, Patrick King, stepped in and said, hey, no deal. We're not going anywhere. So do the current actions seriously threaten Canada's sovereignty and security? Well, the evidence says yes. When you take a close, honest look at the people calling the shots in the protest, do their actions seriously threaten Canada's sovereignty and security? Yes, absolutely. Patrick King, who's demonstrated significant influence in the Ottawa occupation, has deposited a great deal of material online. I'm going to quote him, and the you in the quote refers to the Prime Minister. I quote, "Someone's going to make you catch a bullet one day. To the rest of this government, somebody's going to do you in." And in another quote, "The only way this is going to be settled is by bullets." The 13 people charged in Coutts, Alberta, by their history of arrests and violence, represent a very clear danger to police and to Canadian society. Want to know what their motto is for change in Canada? Guns or rope. How many times, Madam Speaker, have we seen news of mass shootings and tragic bloodshed and loss of life, only to find out in the aftermath that, oh, there were signs that the authorities should have picked up? Well, signs have been picked up, and this government will not want the postscript to an act of domestic terrorism to be an indictment by Canadians that we didn't act. And this gets us to the real point of the protest, the real agenda of the people behind it. You see, theirs is a world of anger, resentment, and hate, of minorities, of immigrants, of the liberal values and the democracy they represent. The core people behind the protests are precisely as the Prime Minister has described them. And many agree. Glenn Pearson, writing in National Newswatch today, noted, "This hatred for hatred's sake doesn't find an easy landing in Canada as it might do south of the border. But as the convoy protest revealed, the hate movement is increasingly interested in this country, hoping to undermine its authorities and replace them with chaos." The goal of such insidious agents was never to help the truckers succeed, but to make sure the government and security forces didn't. Some of the messages put out by the protest leaders make it abundantly clear that Glenn Pearson is right, that the blockades and occupations have little to do with vaccine mandates and even less to do with truckers. They say Canada should eliminate vaccine mandates for truckers operating back and forth across the US border. They know that that's a ridiculous rationale for this protest, as long as the US demands anyone entering their country be fully vaccinated. We could eliminate our vaccine mandate right now for truckers, but those truckers would still be out of work and still be out of luck. And 90% of our truckers agree they're fully vaccinated. So this foolish premise for the protest has no traction. Now, the protest leaders and their political familiars frame their actions as a legitimate dissent of government actions, and that's allowed in Canada. But the protest leaders have tried to obscure the methods that they're capable and possibly threatening to use. Well, we're on to them. They know and we know that those methods are not allowed. They are illegal. And given the size and scope of the blockades and the occupations, given the amount and the sources of the funding to support it, Canada's security and sovereignty are most certainly under attack. 2/3 of Canadians agree, and justified, careful measures applied the emergency powers in the Act with parliamentary and legal oversight in cooperation with the provinces who need our support. That is what this debate is intended to examine. And the majority of Canadians will be looking for justified, careful, and measured opposition in this debate, offered in the interest of doing what's best for the country. Because what's best for Canada, even when difficult to do, is our government's agenda, and it should be the agenda of everyone debating this measure over the weekend. Thank you, Madam Speaker.